Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to AJ507 Ethics in Criminal Justice. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. So today's lecture is going to cover Chapter 2, where we're going to talk about determining moral behavior. So a lot of content to cover. Let's go ahead and just jump right into Chapter 2. First, let's take a look at the learning objectives. We're going to run across some definitions, and then, with that being said, don't forget about your weekly key term assessment that's built into each one of your weekly modules to help you learn some of the different definitions. But we're going to define the deontological and teleological ethical systems, and then explain or look at the difference between formalism and utilitarianism. We're going to describe how other ethical systems define what is moral, things like ethics of virtue, natural law, religion, and ethics of care. We'll discuss the argument as to whether egoism is an ethical system. We'll explain the controversy between relativism and absolutism, a lot of isms, right? Or universalism. And then identify what is good according to each of the ethical systems that we've discussed in the chapter. So a lot of content. Let's go ahead and dive right in. Now, our principles of right and wrong form a framework for the way that we live our lives. But where do these principles actually come from? I mean, think about it. I'll ask you a question. If you believe stealing is wrong, why do you believe it? So where does that come from, right? Now, a lot of you might have said, it comes from my parents. They taught me about right, wrong, and this and that. Or maybe somebody said, hey, my religion forbids me to do this. Or maybe because society can't tolerate people harming one another, your answer to this question, is, kind of along the realm of society. But either way, ethical systems provide the answer to the question of why something is right or something is wrong. And we're going to define what those are in just a few minutes. So, again, your answer to this question is an indication of your ethical system. And ethical systems provide that answer to the question of why something is right or something is wrong. So a lot of different things to kind of think about as we get going. So what then, by definition, is an ethical system? Well, by definition, it is a structured set of principles that defines what is moral. And on page 25 in your textbook, it has the ethical pyramid. And it's a little more detailed than the one that I have here for you, but it talks about moral judgment, moral rules, and then the ethical system, kind of how it comes about. All right. And we'll take a little bit, we'll take a closer look in just a second. But C.E. Harris in 1986 used the term moral theories or moral philosophies instead of ethical systems and defined them as follows, okay? So basically a systematic ordering of moral principles that, one, form the basis for moral judgments, two, are the source of moral beliefs, three, are beyond argument, four, are internally consistent, and then five, possess a type of moral common sense. Now, Boulez in 1977, and we'll get there in just a second, further described ethical systems as having characteristics as well. So he goes on to basically say, hey, look, these ethical systems that we're talking about, right, these structured set of principles that defines, what is moral, have the following characteristics. So the first one, they are prescriptive, meaning that certain behavior is demanded or prescribed. They're not just an abstract principle of good and bad, but have substantial impact on what we do. Next, they are authoritative. So they are not ordinarily subject to debate, if you will. Once an ethical framework has been developed, it is usually beyond question. Next would be they are logically impartial or universal. So moral considerations arriving from ethical systems are not relative. The same rules apply in all cases and for everyone. And then finally, they are not self-serving. So they are directed towards others. What is good for everyone, not just the individual. Now, we don't consciously think of ethical systems, but we use them to make judgments, right? So for instance, we might say that a person who leaves their child alone to go out drinking has committed an immoral act. And that would be a moral judgment. Consider that the moral judgment in any discussion is only the tip of the pyramid, right? So we talked about that little ethical pyramid, right? If forced to defend the judgment, we would probably come up with some rules of behavior that underlie the judgment. Moral rules in this case might be as follows. Children should be looked after. One shouldn't drink to excess. Mothers should be good role models for their kids, etc. So again, when you look at that pyramid, and I'll go back to it, you kind of start to look at, so the moral judgment, a person who goes out drinking, leaving her children at home is bad. That's our judgment. Well, the rule could be, again, people should not drink to excess. Children should come before self. People should take care of their kids. One should know one's duty. Those would be the rules. And then the system, this could be ethical formalism or utilitarianism or religious ethics of care, etc. So that's kind of how that ethical pyramid works. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. But take a look at it on page 25 and see if that helps kind of add a little bit of context, if you will. So let's look now at the ethics of virtue. So the question of what it means to be a good person really is an ancient one. And we'll begin our discussion of ethical systems with, Aristotle. So, as you read in chapter 1, Socrates associated virtue with knowledge. Ignorance led to bad behavior because if one was rational and wise, he or she would know that, virtue was, and behaved accordingly. Socrates and Plato identified 4 virtues: wisdom, fortitude, temperance, and justice. Now, again, the ethics of virtue asks the question, okay, what is a good person? And the roots of this system are really in the works of Aristotle. So again, if you recall, Socrates associated virtue with knowledge, and ignorance led to bad behavior. Socrates and Plato identified 4 virtues: wisdom, fortitude, temperance, and justice. Aristotle basically disagreed with the idea that bad behavior occurred, only through ignorance, and argued that there were people who chose to behave, in a way that's not virtuous, right? They had their own choice, therefore they made that choice. And he answers the question, what is a good person? Aristotle believed that to be good, one must do good, right? So, an emphasis on virtue. So hopefully that makes sense. And virtues that a good person possesses include things like thriftiness, temperance, humility, industriousness, and honesty. Okay, so he defined virtue as excellence, if you will. So ethics of virtue, by definition, an ethical system that bases ethics largely upon character and possession of virtues. Okay, and I know a lot of this might seem a little confusing, especially if you don't know it, but I do kind of every once in a while plug in like definitions so you can kind of see what each definition is, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. So we've already defined ethics of virtue, the ethical system that bases ethics largely upon character and possession of virtues. Eudolomina, the Greek term denoting perfect happiness, of flourishing, related to the way to live a good life. Okay, and Aristotle believed that eudaimonia was basically the goal of life, and this word, like I said, it translates to not only to happiness, but another translation is flourishing. Okay, so again, some kind of interesting concepts that we're talking about. And then we have the principle of the golden mean, a concept of moderation in which one should not err towards excess. And again, that was, Aristotle. So, habits of moral virtue are developed by following the example of a moral exemplar, that is, a parent or a virtuous role model. And these habits are also more easily instilled when right or just laws also exist. So moral virtue is a state of character in which choices are consistent with the principle of the golden mean. This principle again states that virtue is always the median between two extremes of character, right? So, quick example, for instance, proper pride is the balance between empty vanity and kind of undue humility. Courage is the balance between, let's say, cowardness and foolhardiness, and so on. So, moral virtue comes from habit, which is why this system emphasizes character. And the idea that one, does not do good because of reason, rather that one does good because of the patterns of a lifetime. So interesting information. And again, you can, read your textbook to kind of fill in some of the little things. So just kind of a little bit of a quick rehash and we'll move on. So again, Aristotle's concept of moderation, principle associated with ethics of virtue. The principle of the golden mean is that virtue is always the median between the two extremes. Okay, virtues that good persons possess, thriftiness, temperance, humility, industriousness, and honesty. So somewhat related to the ethics of virtue ethical system are the 6 pillars of character brought about by the Josephson Institute of Ethics in 2008. And the 6 pillars of character, they kind of echo Aristotle's virtues. And they include trustworthiness, respect, responsibility, fairness, caring, and citizenship. A little bit more detail on kind of what they mean. So trustworthiness is the concept, encompasses honesty and meeting one's obligations. Honesty means to be truthful, forthright, sincere. This pillar also involves loyalty, giving up to one's beliefs, or living up to one's beliefs, sorry, and having values. Respect. This pillar is like the second portion of the categorical imperative of ethical formalism, and we'll cover this later. The concept admonishes us to treat each person with respect and not as a means to an end. It's kind of like the golden rule in Christianity: do unto others as you would want, those to do unto you, etc. Responsibility. This means standing up for one's choices and being accountable. Everyone has a moral duty to pursue excellence, but if one fails, the duty is to take responsibility for that failure. Fairness. This concept involves the issues of, equity, impartiality, and due process. To treat everyone fairly doesn't necessarily mean to treat everyone the same, but rather to apply fairness in one's dealings with everyone. Caring. This pillar encompasses the ideas of altruism and benevolence. It's like ethics of care, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. And then finally, citizenship. This includes the duties of every citizen, including voting, obeying the law, being a good steward of natural resources of one's country, etc., and doing one's fair share. So those would be basically the 6 pillars of character that echo Aristotle's virtue, and remember, they're from the Josephson Institute of Ethics. So, when we talk, again, ethics of virtue basically assumes a good person will, in fact, make a good decision, and little help for people facing dilemmas. Okay, because we're talking about ethics of virtue, something a little bit different than we went over. Okay, so the next would be what we natural law. So the natural law ethical system holds that there is a universal set of rights and wrongs that is like many religious beliefs, but without reference to a supernatural figure. Now, some people say that would be the idea, could be like the 10 Commandments. And it kind of goes on to, talk a little bit more. Originating most clearly with the Stoics, natural law is an ethical system where no difference is recognized between physical law, such as the law of gravity, and moral laws. Morality is part of the natural order of the universe. And further, this morality is the same across cultures and times. So again, and there's a lot more to this, okay, which, I don't have time to really cover every single thing. The pursuit of knowledge is recognized as a natural inclination of humans. And what we call natural rights are the rights that everyone has purely by virtue of basically being alive. So again, by definition, natural law, the idea that principles of morals and rights are inherent in nature and not human-made. The natural law ethical system, presupposes that what is good is natural and what is natural is good. So for instance, preservation of one's own being is a natural inclination and thus a basic principle of morality. So, just questions to think about. How can we determine then what is natural law versus man-made law? And what are the natural laws of morality? So, things for us to just kind of think about as we go through this particular chapter. So, next would be religion. So, religious ethics is, of course, much broader than simply, Judeo-Christian ethics. Religions such as Buddhism, Confucianism, and Islam also provide a basis for ethics because they offer explanations on how to live a good life and address other philosophical issues such as what is reality. Now, pantheistic religions such as those, kind of primitive hunter-gatherer societies promote the belief that there is a living spirit in all things and tend not to be as kind of judgmental as religions. We are more familiar with, we're familiar with Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. A religion must have a willful and rational God or God figure before there can be a judgment of right or wrong, thus providing a basis for an ethical system, right? And those religions that do have a God figure consider that figure to be the source of principles of ethics and morality. So by definition, religious ethics, okay, the ethical system that is based on religious beliefs of good and evil. Now, just kind of talking a little bit more on that. A fundamental question discussed by philosophers and Christian religious scholars is whether God commands us not to commit an act because it is inherently wrong, or, whether an act acquires its badness or goodness solely from God's definition of it, right? And another issue in Western kind of religious ethics is basically how to determine, God's will. Some believe that God is, inviolable, and that positions on moral questions are absolute. This is a legalistic position, and others believe that God's will varies from time to time, kind of the situationalist position. So a couple of different things to understand, but Berry in 1985 wrote that humans can know God's will in three different ways. First would be individual conscience. So an individual's conscience is the best source for discovering what God wants to do. If one feels uncomfortable about a certain action, it's probably wrong. Two would be religious authorities. These authorities can interpret right and wrong for us and are our best source if we are confused about certain things. And then the last one would be Scripture, Holy Scripture. The third way would be go directly to whatever written word is there, whether it's the Bible, the Quran, or the Torah, as the source of God's law. And some believe that the written word holds the answers to all moral dilemmas. So again, there's people that are on board with this, and there are people that aren't. So just kind of open your mind up a little bit and just understand, this is the emphasis, if you will, on religious ethics. And then we're going to talk about ethical formalism. And real quick, on page 32 and even page 33, there's kind of an overview of major world religions. It talks about Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Confucianism, Hinduism, etc. So you can go through there if you want to know a little bit more about each one of those. Okay, so to summarize on the religious ethics side, the religious ethics system is widely used and accepted. The authority of the God figure is the root of all morality. Basic conceptions of good and evil, or right, and wrong, come from interpretations of, God figure's will. And going back to the dilemma of whether to go along with a friend who steals, using Christianity as an ethical system, one need, not look further than the Ten Commandments, right, to see clear direction that stealing is wrong. Thou shalt not steal. So letting someone do it under your supervision would make you complicit to that. So, we talked in an earlier chapter that sometimes some of these ethical dilemmas are dealt with because there's a law, a policy, etc. Well, here there's like this in this particular case, the written word in religion. So that kind of helps clear those dilemmas up. But, there's a lot of other things to think about. Okay, ethical formalism. So ethical formalism is a system espoused by Immanuel Kant, and it focuses on duty. The ethical system that focuses on duty holds that the only thing truly good is a good will, and what is good is that which conforms to the categorical imperative. So kind of a tough definition, but let's see if we can't kind of break it down a little bit. So Kant believed that moral worth comes with doing one's duty. Just as there is the law of the family, like the father's rule, etc., the law of the state and country, and the law of international relations, there is no universal law of right and wrong. Okay, so kind of keep up with me. I know it's kind of tough still. Now, ethical formalism is also a deontological system, and when you kind of define that, it's the study of duty or moral obligation, emphasizing the intent of the actor, the person, as the element of morality without regard to the consequences of the act. So, if an act is inherently good, it is still considered a good act, even if it results in adverse consequences. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. And I know that sometimes it can be a little bit, a little bit confusing in there, right? So Kant also distinguished between, distinguished hypothetical from categorical imperatives. All right. So let me kind of give you a little background on that to kind of slow things down for you, because I know this can be a little confusing. So Kant believed that moral worth, again, comes from doing one's duty. And again, just as there is the law of the family, law of the state, law of the country, relations, international relations, universal, there's no universal right or wrong. Morality arises from the fact that humans, as rational beings, impose these laws and kind of strictures of behavior upon themselves. Now, Kant was a Christian, but he also believed that what is good could be discovered through pure reason. So, kind of getting to where we're at now, Kant distinguished hypothetical from categorical imperatives. And hypothetical imperatives are commands that designate certain actions to attain certain ends. An example is, if I want to be a success, then I have to do well in college. Or if I want people to like me, then I have to be friendly. Okay, so that kind of, if I want something, I got to work for it kind of deal, right? And that kind of, makes sense in some aspects. By contrast, though, a categorical imperative commands action that is necessary without any reference to intended purpose or consequence, right? The imperative of morality needs no further justification. So, or rationalization. So the concept that some things just must be with no need for further justification, explanation, or even rationalization. So with that, let's kind of look at some principles, okay? The principles of Kant's categorical imperative of morality. So first would be, act only on the maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So in other words, for any decision of behavior to be made, examine whether that behavior would be acceptable if it were a universal law to be followed by everyone. So for instance, a student might decide to cheat on a test. But for this action to be moral, the student would have to agree that everyone should be able to cheat on the test. Next, act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or that of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. And this is kind of written on how he thought, so I know it kind of sounds weird, which is why I'm kind of breaking it down. So in other words, one should not use people for one's own purposes. For instance, being friendly to someone so that you can use their car is using that person as a means to one end, meaning like I'm only being friendly so I can get your car. So that's another one. And then finally, act as if you were, through your maxims, a lawmaking member of a kingdom of ends. And what does that mean? Well, this principle basically directs that the individual's actions should contribute to and be consistent with universal law. All right. So again, these are interesting concepts just to kind of think about as you're talking a little bit about ethical formalism, etc. Now, a system such as ethical formalism, it's not absolute. Okay, so we do have to kind of, understand that, right? If something is wrong, it is wrong all the time, such as murder or even lying. To assassinate evil tyrants like Adolf Hitler, Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden might be considered moral under a teleological system, and we'll talk, more fully discussed, which concerns itself with consequences, etc. In the deontological view that we're talking about, if the act and intent of killing are wrong, then killing is always wrong. Thus, the assassination must be considered immoral in all cases, regardless of the good consequences that might result. All right, so there's criticisms of this ethical formalism, right? And let's take a quick look at those. So ethical formalism seems to be unresponsive to extreme circumstances. So if something is wrong in every circumstance, regardless of the good that results or good reasons for the action, good people might be judged immoral. Morality is limited to duty. Well, one might argue that, duty is the baseline of morality, not the highest aspiration of it. Further, it's not always clear where your duty might lie. At times, one might face a dilemma where two duties conflict, and then what do you do? And then finally, the third one, the priority of motive and intent over result is problematic in some cases. It may be seriously questioned whether the intention to do good, regardless of result or perhaps with negative results, is always moral. Many would argue that the consequences of an action and the actual result must be evaluated in order to determine morality. All right, so those were tough. I know they are. There's a lot of definitions, a lot of different things, but we kind of got through it, all right? So next we're going to take, well, you know what? This might be an actual okay place to start because you've had a lot of different terminology, definitions, etc. So I think what I might do is I might stop here and then we can finish up. So yeah, let's go ahead and do that. So we're right about the 34-minute mark. I'll stop here and then we'll come back for part 2.